With a possible tampering punishment looming, will it force the Atlanta Falcons to trade back in round one?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for far too long, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. I appreciate each and every one of you that have stuck with me for so many years. As everydayers of this illustrious podcast, make sure you become an everydayer. Make this podcast your first watch or first listen of the day by subscribing and following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And please, if you haven't already, subscribe on YouTube. Trying to get to 10,000 followers in the next 72 hours between now and the 2024 NFL draft. But today's episode, we'll be talking all about the Falcons moving up and down via draft trades. I know the big news of the day was Matt Ryan officially announcing his retirement today. And to be honest with you, we probably won't spend too much time talking about Matt Ryan on the podcast until probably like July, maybe late June, once we sort of exhaust all the topics of the day over the next probably 6+ weeks. We try to stay topical with the present and future of the Atlanta Falcons here on this illustrious podcast, rather than looking back at the past. So, July will probably give us an opportunity to look back at the past and talk a little bit more about Matt Ryan. So if you were expecting, Matt Ryan to get his flowers on today's episode, he will get his flowers, as he has a number of times on this podcast, but that is not on today's agenda. But today's agenda, the other news of the day was a report from Adam Schefter of ESPN, which is that the NFL's investigation into the Falcons and Philadelphia Eagles' alleged tampering for Kirk Cousins and Saquon Barkley, respectively, could, emphasis on the word could, reach a conclusion as early as this week. And comparatively, his sources tell us that the Falcons are expected to get a more severe penalty for their, involvement with securing Kirk Cousins than the Eagles are with Saquon Barkley. And this goes back to a conversation we had back in March. And he sort of cited the examples of previous tampering penalties, the Dolphins losing their 2023 first round pick and 2024 third for multiple instances of tampering from 2019 to 2022 involving Tom Brady and Sean Payton, and the Chiefs losing their 2016 third and 2017 sixth for their instances of tampering with Jeremy Maclin in 2015. And so, it seems more likely that the Falcons will get something more on par with what the Chiefs got hit with and what the Dolphins got hit with, as we suggested in March. But as I suggested back then, like in the 18 years that Roger Goodell has been the commissioner, no one has ever come off of one of his punishments and said, we got off pretty lightly. So I always basically say, whatever you think is a fair punishment, kind of dial that up a little bit, is probably what will wind up happening. So, if the Falcons lose a day 2 pick, like, for instance, instead of using a third and the sixth, right, maybe they lose a third this year and a fourth next year or something like that. So we'll see what happens, but, we'll see if we get word on that in the next 72 hours. They'll be cutting it very close. And, with each day that passes, like it feels like really, but we'll see how that goes. But, it does seem to add fuel to the fire of trading back, right? And we mentioned trading back as one of the 4 primary options that the Falcons could use that 8th overall selection that they hold. The other 3 are taking one of the top 2 edge rushers in Dallas Turner of Alabama, Laiatu Latu of UCLA, or taking a wide receiver, the 3rd wide receiver off the board, which presumably is going to be Rome Odunze of Washington. But trading back always was on the table, and still was, even without the tampering punishment potentially looming, is still a good strategy, regardless of whether or not the Falcons lose draft picks, right? Trading back, you'll be able to recoup some draft picks. But, I think even if the Falcons don't get punished this year's draft, getting ahead of next year where you're likely to lose picks, and adding some assets this year when you have, we'll talk a little bit more about it later, prime opportunities to add draft capital in this year's draft makes sense to me. But, we'll see what the Falcons do. I think the Falcons have probably more holes than your average person. There's been multiple guests on the podcast over the last couple of months that have come on and said like, oh, the Falcons roster is pretty good and they don't have too many holes. And I just kind of smile and nod to that. I don't really agree with that. Like you arguably could use 4 defensive starters at edge, corner, safety, and nose tackle, right? You could use another starter on offense at wide receiver. Wide receiver 3 is technically a starter in this offense. And, it's hard to get starting caliber players after rounds 3 and 4, right? So, with 5 potential starters that you need, you have 5 picks in the first 4 rounds, and you might lose one of those or more, like it's gonna be hard to fill all those needs. And not to mention, I think the Falcons have a lot of depth issues, right? They could use improved depth at pretty much every position across the roster, but I would say the priorities would be in no particular order: tackle, guard, linebacker, tight end, quarterback, right? And with 3 day 3 picks, that you could wait theoretically to get those depth pieces, after in round 5 or later, 3 picks isn't enough to solve all those issues. And, is it realistic that the Falcons can fill all these holes in the draft? No. And we've been talking for weeks now since free agency cooled off that the Falcons are likely to be proactive in free agency after the draft so they can fill some of those holes. But again, I think it totally makes sense for the Falcons to accumulate as many assets as they can, cheap assets via the draft, right? And, moving back in round 1, you can pick up some potential starting caliber players in rounds 3 and 4 with some of the trade back talks. If you move back on day 2 or whatever, you could potentially pick up, day 3 picks so you can add some of that depth in round 5 and round 6 and round 7. I think that would do wonders for this roster and make me, a little less disgruntled about their, in my opinion, lackluster free agency haul outside of Kirk Cousins. So we haven't seen the Falcons trade up or down in round 1. We have seen plenty of trades in round 2, and we'll talk about that later in the episode. But I do want to talk about, some of their trade back options in round 1. Like, what are some realistic places where we could see the Falcons move back by talking about some of the other teams that might be looking to move up. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So guys, it is springtime, and that means baseball is back, and Game Time is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which is going to make getting baseball tickets even easier, right? Faster and easier. And the beautiful thing about Game Time is their killer last minute deals, right? You can save up to 60% off buying last minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc., but especially for baseball. If you're just sitting there like, it's a beautiful day, there's almost always a baseball game, every single day, depending on your market. And you would say, it's a beautiful day. Let's go out and enjoy a hot dog and a beer or whatever at the stadium. And Game Time is going to allow you to make those spontaneous spur of the moment decisions. And they're going to have great flash deals, all in prices, the view from your seat. They're taking the guesswork out of buying tickets. So download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL. You'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So before we get into the Falcons round 1 trade back options, let's plug, a place where there were some trades not involving the Falcons, although I was interested in making a trade, but I didn't get a good enough offer. That is, of course, the Locked On NFL mock draft, now available, the 6-part series going through all of the top 32 picks made by the local experts on Locked On, like myself, as well as some of the teams that don't have first round picks. Is available currently on the Locked On NFL Draft podcast feed, audio, YouTube. So go check it out. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, trading up or trading back, I should say, trading up, I saw a mock a couple of weeks ago that had the Falcons trading up for Marvin Harrison. I was like, that's an interesting conversation, but we're not going to get into that on today's episode. Let's talk about trading back. I think a lot of people think trading back, because I think, my crusade against mock draft simulators, this is part of my crusade, is I think mock draft simulators, because it's so easy to trade up and trade back, it makes people think that trades are much more viable, much more realistic in reality than they actually are. And the part, having a computer simulate these trades makes it easier to trade up, because there is a human element that general managers basically are humans, and they don't want someone to be like, oh, you lost this trade, you got fleeced. And so the ego comes into it. And I think that's one of the reasons why trades relatively speaking, are rare in the NFL, but we do know when trades do happen, they typically happen on draft day or draft night, whatever you want to call it. So let's explore some of the options the Falcons could have trading back. We've mentioned before, could they move back, one or two spots with Chicago picking at 9, the Jets picking at 10, because one of those teams wants to come up for that third wide receiver. Right? In this hypothetical situation, though, is a third wide receiver, presumably Roma Dunze of Washington or Malik Neighbors of LSU, that would open up the floodgates potentially for someone wanting to come up for that third wide receiver, because those guys are kind of perceived to be, in most drafts would be top 5 picks, but because of the quality of quarterback, the presence of Marvin Harrison Jr. at the top of this draft class, that those guys won't go as high as they normally would go. Now, I'm skeptical that Chicago would want to move up, because basically outside of the 2 first-round picks that they have at 1 and 9, they have a 3rd and a 7th, right? And if they trade up and give up, say, that 3rd, do they want to come away from this draft with a 1, 2 1s and a 7, only 3 draft picks? That seems doubtful. So I think Chicago's probably more likely to stay put or even move back. The Jets, certainly, could they go all in on that 3rd pass catcher in this draft, or an offensive tackle? They have a need at offensive tackle, and there's a chance that, say, Tennessee takes the 3rd wide receiver at 7 instead of taking the offensive tackle like Joe Alt of Notre Dame. Does the Jets want to come up for a tackle? Maybe. That's a possibility. I think where trades become a little bit more realistic than moving back 1 or 2 spots is pick 11, right? And we know Minnesota currently holds that pick. They're a QB needy team. There's been speculation for weeks now that they're going to try to trade up for one of the quarterbacks into the top 5, Drake May of North Carolina, JJ McCarthy of Michigan. Does that change the math, right? But let's say there's a world where they really love Drake May and they like JJ McCarthy, right? And the Patriots take Drake May at 3. And they're like, yeah, we like JJ McCarthy. We're going to move up for him so that the Broncos or the Raiders or somebody else picking behind us that needs a quarterback doesn't leapfrog us to get their guy, that 4th guy. But we don't feel like JJ's worth giving up 2 1s, which is currently what the Vikings have at 11 and 23. And instead, we'll give up our 2 4ths to go from 11 to 8 with the Falcons. And that's worth it. So that's a possibility, right? Or Minnesota does trade up into the top 5 with the Chargers picking at 4, or the Chargers picking at, with the Cardinals picking at 4, or the Chargers picking at 5. And all of a sudden, those teams, particularly Arizona, is like, we want to come away with the 3rd wide receiver, right? We pass on that guy at 4 or 5 so that we can get, another 1st round pick. And now we're going to give up, Arizona has 3 thirds, right? We're going to give up that to go up and get that 3rd wide receiver. The Chargers have a 3rd, of course. And maybe they want to go up for a wide receiver or a tackle. Who knows? So I think that's a possibility. So a move to 11 to me makes more sense than 9 or 10. 12 is a possibility. Denver is a QB needy team. If Minnesota isn't aggressive, we know Sean Payton is very aggressive when it comes to trading up in the draft, whether last year in Denver or all his years in New Orleans. Could they come up for a quarterback at 8? Possibly, right? The Raiders, they seem like a long shot to move up. It seems like if they do want to go up for a quarterback, it'll be Jaden Daniels, given the Antonio Pierce connection that he has. But I think they're worth mentioning because I thought Bill Barnwell had an interesting trade in one of his mock drafts, Bill Barnwell of ESPN last week, where he basically had trade suggestions for all 32 picks. And he had the Raiders coming up for a tackle, which again, I'm skeptical of, because I think they probably are a little bit higher on Thayer Munford, their right tackle, than most outsiders are. But coming up for a tackle and giving up a 3rd and edge rusher Malcolm Kuntz. And the Kuntz part of it is the intriguing part of it, because he's coming off a very productive year, 8 sacks, 52 pressures, most of that production, all of his sacks, and 38 of his pressures coming in the final 9 games when Antonio Pierce became the interim head coach. And if you just look at the last 10 weeks of the season where he got the bulk of that production, PFF graded him as a top 15 edge rusher, a top 15 pass rusher down the stretch. Now, obviously, probably a lot of that had to do with all the attention that Max Crosby was getting on the opposite side of the field, and he was benefiting from that more than the other guys on the Raiders front. But the reason why Barnwell suggested this as a trade, because Raiders just used the 1st round pick on Tyree Wilson. Kuntz is entering a contract year. He was a 4th, 6th round, day 3 pick. I can't remember what round he was picked in 2021. And so if he continues to build off of that year, he may be the new Bryce Huff, right? And we saw Bryce Huff get a bag from the Eagles this offseason, and the Raiders may be like, look, we're not going to pay him that type of money to keep him, so might as well give up and get some draft capital, maybe for a quarterback or a tackle or something. So that's a possibility. Again, I don't think that's likely, but it's at least an interesting conversation to have. Now, after that, I think you get into less trade back territory. 14, the Saints, intra-divisional trades do happen, right, between division rivals in the draft, but they're not that common. So I don't think that's very likely. The Colts at 15 seem more likely to trade back, given Chris Ballard's tendencies, their general manager, than trading up. 16, I don't see Seattle going gung-ho for a tackle or a wide receiver. They need like a guard rather than that. And so they probably don't trade up to 8 to get that guy. 17, I think, is interesting because Jacksonville could trade up, right? They lost out. They didn't retain Calvin Ridley, right? And I know Falcon fans want to fleece the Jaguars a little bit more than they could have. So if the Jaguars are like, let's go get the third wide receiver, right? We know Trent Baalke, their general manager, has been historically aggressive when it comes to trading up in round one. Instead of, could you actually get Jacksonville's second round pick now, right? Because now when you look at the trade charts, going from 8 to 17 is more likely to involve a second round pick than a third round pick, right? The other trades that we're talking about, going back to 12 or 13, is probably you're getting a third. In the case of the Raiders, maybe you're getting something else in that. But, this is where you could get that second round pick that the Falcons lost out on when the Jaguars failed to re-sign Calvin Ridley. So maybe that would be fun, right? And I do think moving back for the Falcons, you can still probably move back as far as 17 to Jacksonville and still maybe get the second edge in this draft class, right? Because there aren't that many edge needy teams picking at the top. It's like Atlanta, maybe Chicago. I don't see Chicago taking an edge at 9, to be honest with you. I think they're probably more likely to take Byron Murphy at 9 than they are taking an edge rusher. And FanDuel tends to agree with me on that one. But I think Locked On Colts co-host Zach Hicks, I know he put out last week that, Dallas Turner, Brock Bowers, the tight end from Georgia, and Quinyon Mitchell, the corner from Toledo, are the Colts' ideal options to fall to them at 15. If one of those guys falls, that's who they pull the trigger on. But it's I could certainly foresee a scenario where 13 of the first 14 picks before the Colts are on the clock are offensive players. I know Peter Schrager put out a tweet on Monday stating that there's only 6 surefire defensive players in round one based off the people he's talked to around the league. I know FanDuel set the over-under for cornerbacks in round one at 5.5, and the under is where the money is going. And they set the over-under for defensive linemen / edge rushers at 6.5. And again, the under is where the money is going. So, it seems like we're going to get under 12 defensive players in round one, potentially, and if we get to 12, we might get to 12, maybe 13. But I could definitely see a scenario where it's only 10 or 11 defensive players taken in round one. And so optically, if you're the Falcons, it doesn't look great to take a defensive player at 8, to stick and pick at 8. And then the next defensive player doesn't come off the board until, pick 15 or something like that. Is Dallas Turner or Laiatu Latu that much better than whoever that next guy is going to be? I don't think so. So I think it makes sense for you to kind of trade back. I can see a scenario. Let's say the Falcons, trade back to 17. Jacksonville comes up for the third wide receiver. The Bears, now they're like, oh, well, we thought we were getting Roma Dunze. We'll take Byron Murphy at 9, right? We need a D tackle, right? And then you get, offensive players going off the board. Then the Colts take Dallas Turner at 15 and being like, oh yeah, he's here. We thought he was going to be long gone. And then the Falcons can still settle, quote unquote, and get Laiatu Latu. And depending on who you ask, they're getting a much better player than they possibly could have gotten at 8, in terms of taking Dallas Turner at that high. So I could see that situation playing out. Right. And so to me, when I kind of look at it, I just if you're going to stick and pick at 8, that's the scenario where you take the wide receiver, right? If your plan is not to take the wide receiver, which is more than a fair plan for the Falcons to make, and you want to take that pass rusher, given, it's probably a bigger need, then I think you should absolutely be exploring and desiring the trade back, doing whatever you can to move back, 3 spots, 5 spots, 9 spots, something along those lines, and still being able to get the top 2, one of the top 2 edge rushers, or even the top 3. You can throw Jared Verse into that conversation, right? And especially if the Falcons, don't think there's a big difference between those 3 players, and various rumors you see on Twitter and elsewhere suggest that they have those guys graded, relatively equally. Get how much stock you want to put in those rumors. Why not move back and get those guys? And I can see people making the argument that taking any of those guys at 8 would be a little bit of a reach. You know, I don't know if I 100% agree with that, but at the same time, like, yeah, like when you compare, traditional edge rushers over the last decade that have been taken in that 6 to 10 range, you can make an argument that none of these guys measure up. Those guys would be Tyree Wilson, Josh Allen, Leonard Floyd, Vic Beasley. Now, when I think Dallas Turner of that group is probably the player most worthy, that looks most like, a typical edge that goes in the top 10. And I know a lot of people like to compare Dallas Turner to Vic Beasley. I don't get that comp. I think people either clearly have an agenda that they're trying to push, or they didn't really watch Vic Beasley or haven't really watched Dallas Turner when they make that comparison. Now, I think if you're comparing Dallas Turner to any of those guys, Josh Allen makes a lot more sense in terms of both of those guys being, maybe Leonard Floyd being good in coverage, also being plus athletes. Turner is a much more explosive athlete than Josh Allen was coming out. The thing about Josh Allen when he was coming out of Kentucky back in 2019, he's kind of a one-note speed rusher. That the majority of his wins came that way in college, and based off of what I've seen, I haven't done deep dive on Jaguars film over the last 4 years, but it seems like the majority of his wins come that way in the NFL. And that's what's interesting to me about Dallas Turner, which again was why the Vic Beasley comps don't make any sense, is because like Dallas Turner doesn't really use his speed rush all that much, right? And that's part of the reason why I think he has so much developmental potential, because like he's not even using arguably what should be his best pitch, which is like a 98 mile per hour fastball. He doesn't really even use it. Like he's purely like using long arms and chop moves and whatnot, and he's like not using his fastball. And it's like, hey, if we can just get you to start using your fastball, there's a lot of untapped potential in that. So that's what I'll say, but we won't go too deeply into that. That may be something we talk about tomorrow, right? In comparing and contrasting these top 3 edges. I did that for the Locked On Falcons Insider, doing a video breakdown of those guys the last couple of weeks. And I think that's worth exploring on the podcast, not just, behind the paywall, right? But, it's not really a paywall, because if you hit that link in the description below, joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons, you can become a Locked On Falcons Insider for free for the next 14 days. It's a 14-day free trial. Then it's $4.99 a month after that point. And not only will you get, those breakdowns of the top 3 edges, the top 3 wide receivers, the top 5 quarterbacks in this draft class, as well as my all 22 breakdowns, post-draft, we're going to do video breakdowns of all the Falcons' actual picks, right? Rather than the potential picks that we've been doing over the last 2 months, right? And so, that will be a great thing for you to get into after the draft. So that 14-day free trial should carry you over into that. And then it's $4.99 a month. So hit that link in the description below. But that may be a conversation in terms of the top 3 edges, talking more about Dallas Turner and what he does well, Laiatu Latu, Jared Verse, etc. for tomorrow's episode. Today, I want to wrap up by talking about the Falcons' trade back options. We know that they love to trade up in round 2, but should they do that again this year? And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But guys, this next segment is brought to you by BetterHelp. And sometimes we all need, sometimes we need to get some things off our chest, right? It's important to let it out, especially to someone who's unbiased on your life. And today, I feel compelled to get it off my chest that I think trading up, regardless of what round it is a poor strategy. That would make me upset. But therapy has, taught me different strategies for coping with my frustration or whatever, meaning you can only control what you can control. And I can't really control whether or not the Falcons trade up or down in the upcoming draft. And you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire. You'll get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. And it is playoff time in the NBA and NHL, and baseball season is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets, guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. Bet on slap shots, home runs, slam dunks, and the NFL draft. As we sit here today, FanDuel has Dallas Turner and Laiatu Latu with even money, right? Plus 250 to be the 8th overall selection. And whether you think those are going to be the picks or somebody else is going to be the pick, what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. So, I've seen many people over the last couple of weeks, Falcon fans and media alike, suggesting that the Falcons could move up, right? Especially in round 2, potentially moving back into round 1. And we've seen the Falcons move around, on round 2, right? every year under Terry Fontenot, they've traded their round 2 pick, right? In 2021, they moved back from 35 to 40, picked up pick 114, took Richie Grant and Drew Dalman with those picks. In 2022, they traded up from 43 to 38 to get Arnold Ebiketie. They gave up pick 114. In 2023, they traded up from 44 to 38 to get Matthew Bergeron and gave up pick 110. And so every year we've seen this team move around in round 2. So it seems like, past precedent is going to tell us that it's more likely that we'll see a round 2 trade than a round 1 trade. Now, for the aforementioned reasons why I think this Falcon team has more holes than they think, I think trading up doesn't make a ton of sense, especially trading back into round 1. I think giving up these 4th round picks, which all these picks that the Falcons, have either acquired or given up, are very valuable, especially those first 10 picks in round 4, which all 3 of these picks, have been, right? Because oftentimes you'll get a round 3 player that quote unquote fell to the top of round 4. Like last year, pick 110 that the Falcons gave up was Tommy Adebawore. And the next pick was DeJuan Jones. And those are 2 guys that many people projected as top 50 picks in last year's draft. In 2021, you landed a 3-year starter, assuming that Drew Dalman continues to start this year, in Drew Dalman at 114, and possibly that he could, start more years if he's re-signed next year. And then 2 picks earlier than Drew Dalman, you got arguably the biggest steal of that 2021 draft, which was Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? And so there is a lot of value picking at the top of round 4, pick 109. And so, giving up one of those picks to move up in round 2, I'm not a fan of that. You're basically giving up 2 starters for 1. And, draft history tells you that your ability to be able to dissuade or to discern who is, worth it is not very good, but we won't get into that on today's episode. But, most often I see people citing going up for a quarterback, going up for a cornerback, or going up for an edge rusher as most often cited for what they could do trading back into round 1, edge primarily being if they go in a different direction at 8, like a wide receiver or something like that, like Chop Robinson. I get the quarterback concern. People are very concerned about the long-term outlook there in the post-Kirk Cousins world. I get that concern. I'm not as worried about it. I don't think moving on from another potential starter, say in round 4, or really if we're trading back into round 1, you're probably giving up one of those thirds. Makes a ton of sense to get a guy that's going to sit the bench for 3 years. If I was a huge fan of Michael Penix or Bo Nix or one of those guys, maybe I could justify it. But, I like those guys, but like not enough to give up a starter for someone who's going to ride the pine for 3 years. Cornerback, you can make I've seen the argument made, like, go up and get CB5, which, consensus rankings is like Kool-Aid McKinstry of Alabama, or maybe if Cooper DeJean of Iowa or Nate Wiggins of Clemson fall. I'm a fan of Wiggins and DeJean, but not enough to give up a starter for those guys. And the argument is, is CB5 or whoever, significantly better than CB6 or CB7 or CB8 that you probably could get if you just sit and pick at 43. You may disagree, but I don't know. I haven't done a deep dive on the cornerback class, in part because I feel like the Falcons will have like a dozen decent options, on day 2, if they want to get a corner. Just get me a guy that doesn't have T-Rex arms and we'll be good. And that's part of the reason why I haven't done a deep dive, because I'll do a deep dive after the draft. But I don't know if those guys, like, CB6, 7, and 8 on the consensus rankings are Ennis Rickshaw Jr. of Missouri, Kamari Lassiter of Georgia, TJ Tampa of Iowa State. I don't know if those guys are, Kool-Aid McKinstry or whoever is drastically better than those guys to be worth giving up a starter. And then edge rusher, I'm a fan of Chop Robinson, but I don't think he's a good fit for the Falcons. Like, Chop to me is a final piece, not a foundational piece. And it's funny because Chop to me is the player that if you're going to compare anybody to Vic Beasley, he would be that guy, sort of a one-note speed rusher, has a smallish frame, doesn't have great power. Chop, I think, has a little bit more speed to power conversion ability than Beasley did. But like, if you already had, a strong group of power rushers and interior rushers and whatnot, and you just kind of we just need a guy that can throw a 98-mile-per-hour fastball off the edge, then Chop would be that piece. But like, the Falcons aren't there yet. Maybe in a year or two, they might be there. We might be looking at this patch rush as like, hey man, that's all they're missing. But I don't think they're there yet. So I'm not a fan of the idea of trading up in round 2, or really in any round at any point. Trade back, accumulate assets. And again, if the Falcons get hit by this tampering penalty, that even makes it even more priority, even if, it's something that doesn't again, doesn't get resolved until next year, I still think adding assets this year is going to help you out to compensate for any lost assets that you might get this year or next year. So that is going to do it for us here, guys. We'll see if the Falcons trade back and follow my advice, or will I be having to talk to my therapist a little bit later about the frustrations that I'm dealing with the Atlanta Falcons. So that is doing it for us on today's episode. We'll probably be talking more about the edge rushers tomorrow, unless something else comes up. That will be your first listen. Check out the Locked On NFL mock draft on Locked On NFL Draft podcast feed on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. It is, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.